With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the start of the unipolar moment, the United States' involvement in Latin America significantly decreased, assured by what was then the lack of a near-peer competitor. The nation's policy towards its southern neighbors, with a few notable exceptions, has largely been one of benign neglect, with engagement primarily focused on stemming migration flows and drug trafficking. Washington's approach today contrasts sharply with its historical, albeit controversial, role in Latin America and the Caribbean islands. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States exercised significant influence over Latin America, justifying its involvement through the 1823 Monroe Doctrine. Arguably, the United States' attainment of regional hegemony in the Americas aided the rise of the country as a superpower capable of engaging adversaries and enemies abroad in their own backyards. Today, as Washington becomes stretched too thin with commitments in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, adversarial powers like Russia, China, and even Iran have made significant inroads in Latin America. The common goal of all these adversaries is to undermine American influence in its own neighborhood while the country is distracted elsewhere. Frustrations with years of neoconservative consensus in Washington has given birth in recent years to the America First movement. Part of this movement's demands is that the country reorient its focus to its own backyard, bolstering engagement with Latin America with the goal of ridding America's backyard of adversarial influences. I recently had the privilege of interviewing Latin America expert J.P. Villasmil on what an America First approach to the Americas should look like. Without further ado, let's proceed to the interview. Welcome to the first episode of Strategic Wisdom. I'm your host, Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C.-based news reporter and security policy analyst. With me is Latin America scholar Juan Pablo Villasmil. J.P. Villasmil is an Intercollegiate Studies Institute editorial fellow at the Spectator. He's a graduate student at Georgetown University, pursuing his master's in security studies. Previously, JP has worked as a diplomacy lab researcher with the U.S. Department of State, focusing on Mexico. He's also a Spark critical language scholar in Chinese studies. JP's commentary on Latin America and U.S. foreign policy has featured in several notable outlets, including Newsweek, Foreign Policy, and the Wilson Center's News Security Beat. Currently, JP is organizing the An America First approach to our Hemisphere seminar series. JP Villasmil, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
The title of your upcoming seminar series mentions an America First approach to our Hemisphere. Could you explain what an America First approach to Latin America and the Caribbean would look like? How will this approach differ from Washington's current engagement with Latin America?
Of course. So, key phrase there is America First. Secondary phrase there is Latin America. So, as someone who speaks Espanol, someone who knows a lot about Latin America, someone who writes often about Latin America, what I've noticed is that a lot of people in this field aren't necessarily America First. Sometimes people get scared with the term America First. So before I go on, America First is only rational in international affairs, to put your country first and its interests first. And when most actors act in that way, America should as well. But what happens when you're such a big, diverse country with many interests is that sometimes those foreign policy spaces are filled with people that have attachments to other regions. Case in point, Latin America. My name is Juan Pablo, and I lived in Venezuela for a portion of my life. Most Venezuela specialists I know care deeply about Venezuela, about democratization in Venezuela, about the leaders in Venezuela, about Maria Corina Machado, and all that. It's nice and it's understandable. And I do have part of my heart is in that place because I cannot escape that history in my family, that family that I have there. But as a person that thinks deeply about foreign policy, I realize that the American government cannot be led by and influenced deeply by individuals that care about other nations to such an immense degree. Those can be in the activist class, those can be writing the articles, but to staff a presidential administration, to staff the Department of State, we should have people that are America first. And that's part of the goal of the seminar series that I'm starting. We are getting a lot of think tank folks, congressional staffers, people that have worked in previous administrations. And the goal is to convene a group of individuals that know about Latin America, but that don't necessarily live and breathe Latin America. And I know that might sound counterintuitive because you want people that deeply understand a country to, write and think and influence policy about the country. But you don't want too much because then what happens is part of what we've seen in the last years, that we try to advance the regional goals, sometimes to the detriment of the U.S.'s goals. That's not good.
So what would you say are some of the main issues with Washington's current engagement with Latin America beyond the issue of diaspora nationalism? And how do you think that these major issues in Washington's engagement can be improved on?
The first thing that comes to mind to me is military aspect of it. And then the secondary one is trade, of course. And immigration comes to everyone's mind. But we already know enough about that. If you're listening to this podcast, I assume you know what's going on with immigration. But let's start with the military aspect. When we think about international affairs and we look at the history, the unipolar moment has ended. Multipolar, we are in a multipolar global order. And when this happens, an intense focus on your regions is increasingly necessary. So the amount of interest we pay to the region, as well as the actions we take to develop those military relationships, although understandably so, Latin America is not a regional superpower when it comes to that. And again, understandably so, I understand that I'm not saying that by focusing more on Latin America, that means forgetting about Asia. I understand that they're more than 50% of the population. Their GDP, global share of GDP is going to be more than 50%. But Latin America is also relevant, militarily speaking, because the landmass that they possess is around 15% of the world's landmass, 8% of the global population, and 6% of the world's GDP last time I checked. And while that might seem small next to Asia, comparable to Europe, not in GDP, but in population, it is our region. It is, as some people say, our backyard. Some Latin Americans don't like that. I don't really. Our neighborhood. And if we're going to intervene in Asia, if you're going to intervene in Europe, in Africa maybe, what will naturally happen is that our adversaries will intervene in our hemisphere. So when our eyes shift to the rest of the world, we should always keep some eyes in our hemisphere. And when you look at some of the military developments in Latin America, for example, in Venezuela, in our Chile Island, where the Russians developed the base, China has massive investments in Venezuela and Brazil. A lot of these are often not properly assessed by some individuals. A lot of the Chinese numbers that come, and now I'm going to shift to some trade. A lot of the Chinese numbers that we look when we assess trade with the region often fall short from reality. In Venezuela, for instance, where they estimated they have around $2 trillion worth of critical minerals, which this connects to the military components as well, as we know. The Venezuelan government, most of its trade with China is under secretive agreements. Same as happening in Bolivia with the lithium triangle there, where they possess most of the lithium reserves in the world, which again is super important for trade, also relevant militarily. And a lot of I remember in 2007, 2008, the Chinese government reported numbers. Also, in 2018, they reported numbers about their trade with disparate sectors in Latin America. And mining accounted around 51% of it. But when you look deeper, Brazil was not in those numbers. And Brazil is, the biggest country in Latin America with ample reserves. So I don't know the exact numbers, but when you add Brazil was not on that report, when you add the fact that in the last 10 years, mining has been number 2, energy has been number 1 in Chinese foreign direct investment. And then when you compare that with the way the U.S. invests in the region, I think our biggest investment recently was $30 million in TechMet in Mexico. Meanwhile, the Chinese are dropping billionaire investments because they have the money and the organizational structure, the industrial policy to do so, but also because I do think they care about the region more than our leaders do. And that should be a red flag. We should care about Latin America more than China, more than Russia. And I'm not even going to talk about Iran. I'll leave that to my friend Joseph Humeyer, who wrote a book on that. But that's a whole other deal. They're all meddling in Latin America. Meanwhile, we're like, anti-imperialism, we're not even going to think about Latin America because look at what happened when we intervened during the Cold War. Okay, man, keep thinking that way and keep acting in the Middle East and in Europe and in Asia and forget about your own hemisphere. That's a good idea.
Now that you bring it, how should the U.S. deal with adversaries in our hemisphere under an America First approach? In the 19th and 20th century, the U.S. had the Monroe Doctrine and a big stick approach, aggressively pushing away foreign powers from intervening in the continent. Should the U.S. adopt a similar muscular approach towards countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua that openly collaborate with adversaries militarily, like the recent Russian exercises near Cuba? Or should there be a different approach?
That's an amazing question. So when we talk about America First in popular culture, we talk about America First as in the people. What's better for the people? The trade dynamics that serve the people, the immigration patterns that serve the people. And I do think that that's priority number 1. And then conversations about hegemony, about maintaining America number 1 in the world, which sounds similar to the concept of America First, comes second. But that does not mean they don't exist. Those also matter. So we need to balance our higher interest, our national, more abstract interest, and by abstract, I don't mean invisible, of maintaining world leadership, while also prioritizing our domestic interests, such as social cohesion, an economy that works for the people, a country that people want to live in. So it's in balancing these out that one can truly have what I believe is a reasonable, tangible America First policy. More specifically to the question of what to do about these adversarial regimes in our neighborhood. When you try to balance those out, what you realize is that the way that we've dealt with some of those adversaries in the name of maintaining regional hegemony in some way, shape, or form, or spreading democracy, fighting communism, has sometimes been to the disservice of our tangible trade interests. I believe that America First should move more in the direction of acting in a, let's say, realistic, let's say, commercial way with Latin America without necessarily forgetting about the principles. But if we hyperfixate on the principles, on the fighting the bad folks, we end up with a problem. So if we look at Venezuela specifically, where I have some knowledge, I am against the just unlimited pressure with no chances for opening, but I'm definitely against approaching Maduro and shaking his hand and being like, "Yeah, let's sit down and negotiate." We need to have the use of pressure and then have reasonable expectations when we use that pressure. Demand change if the change is met, and that change should not be just become a democracy. That change should be, hey, we want us to be more involved in your economics. We would like if you stop doing X, Y, and Z militarily. If you want some access to our market, we will grant that. If you also listen to our tangible, concrete national interests. So that's what I think it's missing mostly in our America First regional policy. Same with Cuba, same with Nicaragua. Again, I know all these people. I grew up in Miami. I care about their causes deeply, but I care about America's cause deeply. And that cause is the American people's well-being, and not just the well-being of every other country in the world.
Would you say that the U.S.'s militant approach towards enforcing democracy and normative norms during the Cold War would actually hurt the U.S.'s interests in the region by alienating other countries? Now, for example, if we look at El Salvador, the U.S. has to some degree been hostile towards Nayib Bukele, who does not necessarily seem very anti-American, but the more hostility in the U.S. shows towards actors like Nayib Bukele threatens to push countries away. Do you think that under an America First approach, the United States should be more tolerant of governments with differing ideas on domestic politics?
Yes. I think that with the Nayib Bukele case specifically, he's an interesting figure. And I know this is, controversial because he's so deeply loved because of what we see in the internet, because he's such an influential figure now in American politics and in foreign policy discourse. He's a more complicated figure, I'll say that. He's not necessarily like America's bestie. No one in Latin America really is America's bestie, if I'm frank. Mm-hmm. But some of them are better than others. So that's where the prioritization process comes in. If someone seems to have a better relationship with the U.S., then that's when we should approach and try to foster that relationship further in advancement of our commercial interests, as well as our migratory security interests. And I think when Nayib Bukele, that's something that we should definitely do. We should calm a bit with all the condemnations, not forget about them. Maybe there are things that are not okay. And I don't believe in this friends, enemies dichotomy in international affairs. Countries are not people. You can be my friend, Andrew, if I like you and if I think you're a good person. But China, Israel, France, Germany, Canada, they're not my friends. They're countries. And we can be allies. We can have joint interests and cooperate and act in international affairs, but they're not friends or enemies. Although I'll say it, I understand the language in politics.
One interesting thing you said is that nobody in Latin America is, quote, America's best friend. We see this with a lot of Latin American leaders having slightly anti-American views critical of the United States. What would you say were some historical, political, and social factors that have pushed Latin America away from the United States? Were there any critical mistakes that you saw in Washington's approach, or was it foreign influence, or a combination of both? And how can the United States incentivize Latin America to cooperate more with Washington and to shed some of the bad blood?
Yes. So the historical component of it all, I'll say, is it's quite complicated to assess, and I think it's often superficially dived into in American colleges. I took a few Latin American classes in the U.S. with professors that they just assessed it as, oh, the U.S. is bad and the people there are mad because the U.S. intervened too much in the past. Partly, yes, I won't say that didn't happen, but most of these countries are not like 90% of their populations hate the U.S. and I don't know, love China. Most of these people just don't like imperialism. They're nationalistic, like most people in the world. They like their countries. And during the Cold War, there were factions that had strong sentiments against the Soviet Union and America. What happened is that in a lot of these cases, America, I would say, sometimes maybe took it too far, or America did not approach, and we could go on a case-to-case basis. That's a lot. America could have done a better job fostering long-term relationships. But aside from this is in regard to the population, and this is understandable, and leaders exploit this. But more importantly, in regard to the elites who ultimately make decisions, the people in government, the people in business. What the U.S. did wrong, I believe, a lot. Maybe not then, because we were in a Cold War, and that's very important not to forget about. It wasn't like the U.S. was intervening and the Soviet Union was not. They were deeply involved. So back then, I would have probably been like, yeah, let's intervene a bit. Just as if I would do the same if some foreign governments were massively, and they're already very involved in Latin America, but if they were, taking out our people and, planning on doing really bad stuff. This is, again, and it's determined by the situation in the world. If we're in a war, if we're in a cold, actual one. But I would say part of the mistake we made with the elites was that we focused on having them do whatever we wanted them to do in our national interest, which again, that's good. But we didn't really portray how this was in their interest as well. And in a world that is transactional by nature and is becoming increasingly so, and we see this in Europe's relationship with China, it's the same with Latin America. When the Chinese come in with massive investments and there are no strings attached or little strings attached, in compared to what we see with the U.S., people say, hey, we're going to build a highway, we're going to build a nuclear plant or whatever. And these people are not condemning us in public when they do so. These people are talking about a mutual development story. And the U.S. has failed to express that to Latin American governments in a concrete way. And I think they can. I think there's a way to say, hey, Latin American friends, we're not the empire that's taking over your institutionality. Actually, it's these other folks. And if we establish a relationship with you, it would improve your environmental protections. It would improve labor rights. We will help you become a superpower with us. We can grow together. That was lacking. And that's still lacking in a lot of respects. When the U.S. talks about Latin America, there's been some improvement, especially with the IRA and other things. We still need more of a regional strategy in which we defend American interests, but we also do so showcasing to our Latin American partners, you can say friends, maybe, how this benefits them too.
You mentioned China's investments in Latin America. With the growth in demand for electric vehicles and semiconductor technology, there has been a demand for minerals and rare earth materials. How has China and U.S. adversaries gained an edge in the continent with regards to these minerals? How do you think that the transition to EVs and prioritization of semiconductor technology play into or should play into U.S. strategy vis-a-vis Latin America going forward?
Despite China's massive figures in Latin America's mining sector, those are probably underestimated. He worked for Freedom House. His name was Gerardo Bertrin. Yes. He said that, for instance, in Venezuela, 65% of China-Venezuela deal terms were unknown. And we see that in other countries as well. And what we observe when we grab every single country and we add it up is that China has developed a very strong influence in especially the mining sector and energy development. And the reason why they can do that is because they can afford it through the way they organize their government, deeply centralized government, in which they use state-owned corporations. They use large amounts of concessionary spending per se, although it's not really how it works in China and when we compare it to the US. And this is worrying because the US does not seem to have, number one, the structure necessary to do that. And the way we've approached this, and I think this is good, is trying to alter the trade dynamics with Latin America with domestic incentives. So in the IRA, what we saw is that there's a provision there that includes a tax credit of $3,750 for U.S. taxpayers who buy electric vehicles that contain a battery with certain percentage of critical minerals, mined or processed in the U.S. or countries with whom the U.S. has signed critical mineral agreements with, or free trade agreements with. With the former, that includes Japan, but with the latter, that includes Chile and Peru. So indirectly, that was really a really good move. So congrats on Congress for that. You didn't destroy anything with that. That is a good provision. I like that one. But of course, the issue with this is that it's not enough. Because yes, we're 25% of the world's GDP approximately. And yes, we do trade with Latin America. We cannot only focus on the import aspect of it, of how much we're importing into the US and how that will change the dynamics. We need to focus on the acquisition. So we need to focus on what our corporations own there, what our allies, not our adversaries, own there. And what we've seen is that although technically speaking, the US is still the main trading partner with Latin America as a whole, 71% of our trade with the region is with Mexico alone. If you go down to South America and you look at the individual countries, China has surpassed the US with Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, almost every Caribbean country. And I could go on and on and on. So the US needs to improve its trade with these countries And part of how we might do this is maybe with some concessionary spending. And this scares some of the conservative folks I know in this sphere who are still stuck maybe in the Reagan-esque, the infinite Reagan-esque daydream, as I like to call it. But maybe the U.S. government specifically, should be putting significant capital forward in the acquisition of mines and helping borrowers and helping banks and helping institutions, helping corporations be more confident in their investments in Latin America. Without the U.S. government's hand in this regard, it's very unlikely that any corporations will independently just start investing massively in those countries. Why? Because, they're very unstable. Yes, kind of the very simplistic view some Americans have of Latin America as communists and narcos. It's a stereotype, but it's also kind of true in some regards. And we need to help our corporations, if we're not going to do it us direct, the government's not going to do it directly. We need to incentivize them to go to Latin America and to go compete with the Chinese there. We have the Mineral Security Partnership is a good start. We also have an America's equivalent to this. Sadly, I think it was Brazil is not on it. Which is crazy, although I understand why not, based on who governs it now. But the U.S. government, if I can be a little more wonky here, the U.S. government could direct the export-import bank to prioritize loans to U.S. companies seeking to acquire mines. The U.S. could do the same with the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. The DFC is the one that I mentioned beforehand. They did the $30 million investment in TechMet in a nickel cobalt mine. I think I had said Mexico. It's actually Brazil, now that I think about it. We should do what we did with that nickel and cobalt mine 20 times more. Because comparatively speaking, $30 million is nothing. If we look at Mexico specifically, we see the same thing too. Well, we keep sending money to Latin America, the U.S. government directly, to advance some very lofty and high-minded goals. But maybe we should start doing some of the transactional, commercial investments too. Maybe we should be throwing money there, not just thinking about, what's better in the long term for Latin Americans to develop as a safely, but also what's better for Latin America to grow commercially with the U.S. and what's better for the U.S. when we think about broader international politics. And before the next question, I'm sorry. This is very important because when we talk about the international aspect of this all and not only the regional one, we know that these investments, though commercial in nature, have a military background to it. We know that when Venezuela hints at their interest in the Essequibo and Guyana, we know that it might seem like, it's just about Exxon, it's just about oil reserves. But we also know that it has something to do with access to the Atlantic. We know that when China gives Hugo Chavez billions of dollars and just forgives and forgives and forgives, he's not just thinking about, maybe this will benefit us when we try to create some deal in the energy sector, cheap oil or whatever. No, we know that this might have something to do with, hey, if the U.S. acts on Taiwan, we need to have a counter threat and we should have it in their backyard. And that's not just Cuba now.
Going off of that, in recent months, there has been chatter of Venezuela invading Guyana's Essequibo region. How do you think the United States should respond to that threat, and how likely is it that Venezuela will invade?
Yes, I wrote a very extensive piece about this topic for Colette, the Australian magazine. So if your listeners want to go check it out, I provide a lot of facts there that may betray my memory now. But the way we should respond, and I think we've appropriately, in some ways, responded so far, is by letting Venezuela know that we are on Guyana's side, letting Venezuela know that all the historical component here, and again, I don't say Venezuela, Guyana's side, I said, Venezuela, we will never sit down and negotiate with you. We will never talk. No, I mean, hey, Venezuela, we don't want you to escalate this. If you escalate this, we don't want the conflict in our region. So we may act. And again, should we act? That's another question. But we should always, let people know that we're willing to act. Sometimes credible threats are necessary. This is all like political psychology stuff. But in regard to the current state of affairs, there was the referendum in Venezuela. As someone who knows a lot about Venezuelan culture, the Essequibo is a historically mentioned region. When you study Venezuelan geography in Venezuela, when you go to the schools there, the Essequibo region it's depicted as an area with some lines, diagonal lines in black and white, and it says area under claim, Guyana Essequibo. So Venezuelans have seen historically that as not Guyana's territory, but in the history books there, the people see it as something that we've been trying to get back. So that's just sort of the internal process of why that referendum succeeded. And even the opposition candidates were like, hey, like international politics wise, maybe this is not good or whatever. But they understand that domestically, like most Venezuelans really, think that the Essequibo is theirs. But aside from this, the U.S., of course, Exxon has massive investments there. They discovered some wells in the last decade and made billionaire investments there. Back in 2008, 2009, 10, Chavez expelled Exxon, basically kicked them out from Venezuela, where they had massive investments as well. So on the commercial aspect, it would be really bad if Venezuela were to take over. Many people seem to think, and I'm not entirely clear on what will happen, and I made that clear in my article, that Venezuela was bluffing. And if I have time, I'll explain this theory. Some people think that this had something to do with the Barbados Agreement, and I'm sympathetic to this view in some regard. Some people think that when Biden approached Maduro and said, hey, we're willing to ease some sanctions as long as you take these steps toward democracy, take some guys out of prison, don't sanction Maria Corina Machado, who is the presidential candidate, who cannot run. She was never left alone by the government, and now there's another guy running as the opposition candidate. Some people think that what Maduro did with Guyana was, number one, domestic in some way. Like he wants to have some popular cause animate the Venezuelan public, especially when a lot of his other policies are not very popular. This one is with everyone. But internationally, diplomatically, it's almost as if Maduro was punching Biden in the face and he was telling him, you showed us your hand, and then you said, change this, and now I'm showing you a knife. So put the sanctions back. Go on and try it. And we see the same with weaponized migration. So Biden says that he wants to send, this, Biden didn't say that. This is behind the scenes. They want to send some Venezuelan migrants back because the wave has been uncontrollable on the southern border. And Maduro says no. And it's almost as if Maduro looks at, some say, weaponized migration, encouraging people to leave Venezuela and head to the U.S. Some see the threat of invading Guyana, which Venezuela doesn't have like the strongest military in the world. They're more powerful than Guyana, of course. They're really small and kind of insignificant militarily wise. But will he do that? What does he win? Maybe this has something to do with the diplomatic component of it all. We want the U.S. to know that we are a wild card. But also, maybe I'm wrong. Some other people say that it's that China's behind it. This theory, it could be somewhat true. I think it's less credible than the first one I posited. Some people say that with conflict in Ukraine, potential conflict in Taiwan, our adversaries in the broad picture are saying, hey, if there's a conflict in Latin America, we can spread the U.S. even thinner. And the Europeans would not do anything when it comes to Latin America. The U.S. is like, we will help Ukraine. But do you really think the French would send some soldiers to like fight for Guyana? Well, maybe, I don't know. There's some like historical love there. I think it's unlikely. At least that's me. So there's also that theory. So there's all these theories. There's some truth to some of them. But again, foreign policy is complicated. That's why we're talking.
Speaking about regional trends, Latin America for a while has seen a rise in left-leaning politicians and parties taking power, with the notable exception of Argentina, of course, where libertarian Javier Milei won a major victory as president on a limited government free market platform. Mexico recently elected leftist Claudia Sheinbaum, a protege of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as president, giving her party Morena a majority needed to amend the constitution. In Colombia, we have former leftist guerrillas like Gustavo Petro become president and take anti-American stances on foreign policy. How will the rise of the left, and the authoritarian left in particular in Latin America, affect American interests in the region and the interests of advancing an America First policy in the region? Will the impact of the rise of the left and the authoritarian left be significant?
Yeah, so a lot of people like to talk about the pink tide when it first started with Chavez and with Castro and Evo Morales. Well, the second pink tide, in my opinion, was even more worse. And I don't know if we can call it pink tide because the country was already, the continent was already pretty pink, but then it became a bit pinker. And that's Chile with Gabriel Boric, which has been a historic partner in the region to the United States. And that's also Colombia, who had also been a country where the U.S. has a base, where the U.S. kind of used it as their center of operations, all things Venezuela. Now it's led by Gustavo Petro, who went to Miraflores, the equivalent of the White House in Venezuela, and shook hands with Maduro, who I believe is partly to blame for some of the other trends we see with immigration, although I guess I'll have to put my conspiracy hat on for that. I think he's, he looks away and he says, okay, Maduro, do whatever you want. Maybe eat in it indirectly. But I don't have a lot of information on that. Well, that's what I believe might be happening. And then in Mexico, I would say is the most complicated of all of them. Because with AMLO's relationship with the U.S. and now Sheinbaum's, it's not as adversarial as it can be, because they're still deeply dependent on the U.S. When you look at our recent, let's say, foreign policy history in Mexico, although AMLO is at heart, I would say, an anti-imperialist, and he doesn't like the U.S. in his heart, he also understands that he cannot just like tell the U.S. to go somewhere really ugly. Partly because of the 71% figure that I mentioned before in regard to trade with the U.S. and Mexico. That's why they've had some conflict with China. They placed some tariffs on China, and then the Chinese equivalent of the State Department went, "Hey, what are you doing? This is really going to damage our relationships." But then you see the Chinese are investing deeply in northern Mexican states and then building all these facilities. But then the U.S. pressures them to, allow for U.S. intelligence to operate in this regard in defense of the U.S.'s national security interests. And Mexico somewhat yields that. So Mexico is very complicated, and it's a case study that we can really dive into. AMLO is not a traditional socialist in the way Chavez is, or in the way Gustavo Petro is. Maybe a bit closer to Lula da Silva in Brazil, I would say. Of course, the State Department has issued statements in the past about how they're worried about the INE, their electoral body there, and when AMLO tried to reform it. And of course, there are many worries with the authoritarian component there, but I would still qualify it as different as the other South American countries when analyzing our policy towards them. But then back to the broader trend, and not to get too distracted with Mexico. I do think, naturally speaking, these left-wing movements tend to be more opposed to the U.S. in the international sphere. A Chinese ambassador gave a speech in Cuba about how they want to challenge U.S. hegemony, and this was back when all the leaders were meeting for the G7 summit, not the one that's happening in Italy, but the one before that. China went to Cuba, and it was really interesting because you saw the Chinese speech was really similar to the Colombian speech, and the Cubans made a speech, and then all these countries made the speeches, and they were all kind of the same. We want to challenge U.S. hegemony. We are independent countries. It's a little funny when they make the sovereignty claims, because sovereignty just disappears from the equation when it comes to China. But they're a bit different because they can challenge U.S. hegemony more forcefully because they depend less on us. So that's what's worrying about it. And when we look at this, there are two options. Option number one is to overthrow them all. Maybe that could be an option, maybe not now. I'm not philosophically opposed to potentially overthrowing a leader if it's really, really bad. I wouldn't say that's necessary right now, but I would say that that's option number one. Option number two is saying, hey, let's be honest about the reality. This is the leader of that country. Maybe there are a lot of places where we can see eye to eye and do what's best for both. But also, those countries where there is no authoritarian left-wing dictators, like Argentina, whatever we think about Javier Milei's specific policies and Javier Milei's character, he's friendlier as an individual to the U.S. and to some other traditional Western allies. So we should elevate that relationship, and we should encourage having, a very strong partnership with Argentina. But that does not mean that we're necessarily going to think like Milei thinks about foreign policy sometimes. When Javier Milei goes, I'm not going to meet with the communists. I am not going to, and he just goes around insulting Petro and insulting Maduro and insulting everyone. The U.S., I think, should be a bit more diplomatic in this regard, especially the Department of State. I have no problem with some congressional figures, some senators condemning some of the autocrats in Latin America. But I do think that the U.S. Department of State specifically shouldn't be too focused on condemning and condemning and condemning and condemning. And maybe that's controversial. I think that's a controversial thing to say in our current politics, but I think it's true. I think that, and I say this as a Venezuelan American, although I like to call myself just an American, that's really controversial, and maybe some people don't like it, but if Maduro's an inescapable reality, and if we don't have how to take him out, maybe we should be willing to pressure them enough, but not to the detriment of our interests. Same with every other land. Same maybe with Cuba. I believe in pressure as a strategy, but pressure without negotiations makes no sense. And that's the case with most countries. I think the U.S., there's the phrase that we hear in the movies, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Sure, but we should be willing to sit on the table with our adversaries, even when some of them support terrorists. And that doesn't mean that by negotiating, we're just going to let them do whatever they want. Negotiation sometimes ends with no positive outcomes to anyone in there. Negotiation sometimes leads to positive outcomes. Negotiation sometimes ends with people leaving the room and screaming at each other. But the act of sitting on the table is not inherently bad. And we need to, that mentality needs to get rid of. And it's very prevalent on the right. And I despise it. I don't like it. I don't like the mentality that we're just going to condemn, and somewhat that's going to change something. Yeah.
As new foreign policy professionals graduate from college and enter think tanks and the foreign service, what paradigm shifts do you think should occur in U.S. foreign policy thinking in general towards Latin America and foreign policy towards the rest of the world?
Keeping up with the theme of our conversation, America first. And I think America first, although it has been appropriated by the right in many ways, it's a concept that everyone should understand and everyone should respect. I think there should be a left-wing equivalent to America first in international relations. Sometimes the left wing, let's say, I don't like the term isolationism because sometimes it's overused, but some of the people with the anti-interventionist views on the left are doing so on some causes where it's worthwhile, are doing so in some causes where it's not. Sometimes their motivations are different. But behind it, there should be an America First view on how this serves the U.S. And on the right, that should be the truth too. America First in foreign policy. My dream, I would say, one of them, is to have a future professionals that care about America deeply become more influential voices when it comes to Latin America policy. As we start the conversation, I know too many people involved in this world, especially in the Latin America sphere, and a lot of them, I wouldn't say they don't care about the U.S., but maybe they don't care as much. Maybe they want to go back to their countries. And again, maybe that's not the most optical thing to say, but it's true. I'm saying it. I know that I've talked to them. And what I want and what I'm trying to do with the America First seminar series, which your listeners want to check it out, they can check it out. They can register if they're interested, is to have a good group of people in a list, have a good group of people meet together and talk about what America First means in Latin America, and have them one day make policy, have them one day serve a presidential administration, have them one day become the staffers in Congress and the think tank leaders. Because when you go to think tanks, a lot of the time, you see two things. You either see the absence of Latin America specialists, or you see the presence of Latin America specialists. But the presence of those Latin American specialists, it'll be, let's say, a person with my name, Juan Pablo Villasmil, who just talks about democracy all day and doesn't talk about everything else, doesn't talk about the trade, and doesn't talk that deeply about the critical minerals. And I definitely want more of that. And it's not just a want, I think it's a need. Americans need more of that. So hopefully we'll get there.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Latin America expert JP Villasmil. JP Villasmil, thank you for your time. JP Villasmil is organizing the America First approach to our Hemisphere seminar series. For more details, contact JP on LinkedIn. You may find him through his full name, Juan Pablo Villasmil, Villasmil. Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using to listen to this show in order to not miss any future interviews and conversations that I bring to you on this podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com. This is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.